Hey everybody, this is Ben. This one's really cool. Just remember, this isn't a contest, but this is a mystery, and we are the detectives. So get ready to channel your inner Sherlock Holmes or Nancy Drew or Encyclopedia Brown, whoever your favorite detective is. Let's jump in. Quick word, I got a couple questions about conflict of interest. I'm more than happy to say I have no conflict of interest here. Doing this unfunded. I'm just extremely interested in the project, and I think there's nothing more important we could be working on than trying to drive out variation and increase accuracy and add anatomical contouring. So I'm helping out. By the way, if you're a collector of any consensus data, get a hold of me. Time permitting, I'll be happy to help you out as well. So the C3RO project, I don't know if they have a grant in particular, but we do owe gratitude to Electa for donating a technology grant. We use Prono to collect the data. So thank you to Electa for that. But otherwise, no conflicts of interest here. I didn't have any relationships with the AI vendors. They were the first three that got back to me when I kind of put the feelers out. So yeah, they did a great job. So what are we going to do today? This is going to be a short summary, kind of culminating the prior videos in this series for the head neck OARs using the C3RO case number 3. And I think in order to best describe what we're going to do here, it's going to be very intuitive, very useful. So I think I'm going to go to the whiteboard, and then I'm going to just show you a bunch of data. And the whiteboard, I'll kind of explain the data I've decided to show. So let me get it. Close enough. Hopefully that works. Okay. I'm going to be showing grids that look like this. We are going to be looking at the 4 expert panelists for this data set for the OAR edition, organs at risk. And we are going to be comparing them with 2 comparison metrics to each other. So expert A versus B, C, and D. We are going to then compare them to where do they best match the consensus. This we kind of went through in video number 2. We went through this with all the pictures and everything. So this will be a summary of that. Then we are going to then compare each expert with the AI vendor 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to repeat that for each expert. We are going to also compare and summarize what we also did in earlier videos, which was to find where the AI best matched the consensus. First thing I want to say about this is everyone opted in. The physicians opted in that they are more than happy to see these results. The AI vendors opted in. I think a lot of people might want to see these 9 quadrants to see how all the AI compare to each other. I'm not going to do that. I think this is what I want to focus on. So what can we learn from this? Well, there's several things. First of all, if you're one of the experts, you can say, which of my colleagues do I agree with the most or the least? That's interesting, at least, to spur on discussion. Get to see, do you agree with an average consensus from, in this case, about 70 of your peers, radiation oncology peers? And then super interesting is to see for the 3 AI vendors that opted in to participate in this study, each physician can say, do I match any of those really well, or all of them, and to what degree? So for any given physician, that's interesting. Obviously for the AI vendors, it's useful as well. You say, which of the physicians do I match, and to what degree? And it's also very useful, I think, for the AI vendors to know how well they match with a population, ISO agreement line. By the way, here I'll not only be giving the metrics of match, but also the ISO agreement line. That was the maximum match. So that's a lot to be garnered from this. And I think one of the big things I want to try to determine here is what's the value of having the consensus? So one hypothesis that I have that we should explore, but is showing promise, is the consensus shows a lot of promise in being a very robust way to supplement or to add to the way you validate your AI. So instead of validating AI against one of your physicians or 2, why not see how they compare to the whole to a larger population? Do they fit within what should be expected? That's a very useful thing. so that you're not, Deming would teach that if you teach AI to match just one particular person, that might be tampering with the system. You might be putting a systematic error into it if that physician isn't perfect every time. So I think looking at a statistical population is very useful for AI vendors, and that we wanted to provide value to them. And I think for the physicians to know, who do I agree with the most? My peers, an averaged population, or robots? I'm intrigued by that question. And I think in general, just, what's the value of the consensus? Because I do think hypothesis 2 would be that these consensus grids that we create with studies like this can be distributed and really have value for AI vendors, for people to study where is the variation, so we can start talking about where the variation is and having the experts then debate and haggle and kind of hone in on driving out the variation, which again could then feed AI engines and they'll become less variable. Only a lot to gain here, nothing to lose. So let's dive in. One more word. The two metrics I'm going to do 2 charts per organ. One chart is going to be, I chose the 2 metrics I actually like the least, but they're the 2 most intuitive ones. So I figured for this, they're intuitive. Metric number 1 is DICE. The DICE coefficient, kind of just at first blush, is a great way to say how much did I overlap. You got to realize DICE can be a failure because where you don't overlap, it'll penalize a 1 millimeter difference the same as penalize a 20 millimeter difference. And those differences clearly aren't equivalent. So that's one problem with DICE. Another problem with DICE is, so they can be undersensitive, but sometimes they can also be oversensitive. If you have really tiny structures and someone draws them really close to each other, just a few millimeters off, but the structure itself is skinny or small, your DICE coefficient can be tiny, even though someone has really localized it to a very precise area. But it's a great way to see overlap. Just realize it's problematic in its sensitivity and its specificity. The other metric I also don't like, it's oversensitive, but it's also intuitive, and that is what's the biggest difference there was in a 3-dimensional sense. You go through the 2 surfaces and say, where's the biggest difference I had? And of course, that metric has a unit of millimeters. So sometimes it can be oversensitive. You can be almost perfect, but have a little spike somewhere, and that number will get really big, even if the volume that was different was very small. So be careful of that one as well. But those are the 2 I'm going to use for now, because I think they're intuitive. So let's look at some pictures. I think the order that we'll go in will be more or less from most consistent to the most variable. But instead of going in this exact order, from bottom to top, we'll do the submandibular gland left, then we'll go ahead and do the right, so that we can kind of see, compare and contrast if they had different results. We did see the right submandibular gland had a lot more variation in contouring in the population than the left did, because it was ipsilateral. So then we'll do the left and right parotid, then we'll do the brainstem, larynx, and pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Here are the first grids. It's a really good sign when you see a lot of green. One thing I forgot to mention, I will color code the cells. For the DICE coefficient, I chose that yellow, I think red would be a 0.5 or lower, yellow a 0.75, and a bright green would be a perfect overlap of 1, and then a continual spectrum over that. And then for the surface difference, again, the more matching it is, the greener it gets. The less matching it is, the more red it gets. And here I think the color coding lookup table was pretty liberal. I think 20 millimeters difference would be red, 10 millimeter yellow, and then as you approach 0, it gets green. So this was our least variable population organ, the left submandibular gland. Let's focus first on how the physicians compare to each other. You can go across kind of left to right or top to bottom. I think just qualitatively we'll see the DICE range everywhere from, say, 0.79 to 0.912. So, not a perfect match, but where is really interesting is that when you compare them to their best match consensus, it exceeded, in almost all cases, not every case, but in almost all cases, the best matching population line matched better than any of the other experts did. So you can see 0.888 is greater than any of these. This one is different, where we had a 0.912, But here, even this, Dr. Caudell's match to a population consensus 0.934 was higher than any of his dice coefficient matches with his panelist colleagues. So that's a really interesting way to look at the data. You can take screen captures of this if you want to dig into it. Now let's continue on. Really promising results here with all of the AI vendors. All right, there's nothing really different, notably with the colors. So they're all in the green spectrum. How do they comparison with the colleagues? One thing I noticed was go across each row. These numbers are all very similar. Whereas if you go across the row of physicians, they do tend to be a little, bounce around a little more. So these AI vendors are pretty consistent with each other in terms of their dice coefficients matching with the experts. Also, both the consensus and the AI tend to have pretty good matching levels across all experts. Whereas any one expert, you can't say that about each other. So what we're seeing here is some pretty robust results for both the consensus and the AI. Then the numbers we got in 3 of the interviews with the AI vendors, they all had very high matching numbers with population consensus. Now, we should pay attention to these numbers too, because it's not like they were all matching the exact same ISO agreement line. But here we ranged a good match everywhere from 35 to 49%. And then when you go best match from the AI to the population, 48, 48, 51, one might hypothesize then that all of these AI vendors are producing very similar submandibular glands. Of course, we could have done those analytics here and seen how they lit up, but I don't think, draw your own conclusions. I didn't want the AI vendors to be in a position where they're, compared to each other. Because you couldn't really draw any conclusions in that other than they're really close or they're not close, which if they're not close, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just have to have them arguing over why theirs might be better. So anyway, this is really promising results both for the consensus and the AI, showing more robust with respect to the experts than the inter-expert comparisons. When we look at the more sensitive metric of the max distance difference, again, we see, and I didn't do this for the consensus. I just did it physicians. So again, you see a more tight distribution, a little more green over here when you're looking for any given physician compared to the 3 AI engines. Tend to look a little bit more consistent with respect to the results than when you compare the physician. So we'll jump over to the submandibular right and see if we get similar results. Not at all. Now, isn't that surprising? So this was the contralateral, pretty well behaved. Here we see a lot of difference. So this was more of a challenge. You'll see a little more gray over here. One physician didn't contour this one, which is fine. So here you see more colors, so there's more variation. But what's interesting here, all this like rainbow of colors, look at the experts versus the consensus. All the numbers are pretty high. We're starting to see that consensus is a really robust kind of thing to look at, okay? If all of the experts in general can find a good match with a consensus level, that's promising for the value of consensus. We look at AI versus consensus, also pretty high. Now this Murata is an outlier here, and if you watched the interview with Mark Gooding, excellent interview. This was the one outlier we saw. The right submandibular gland, they had a little bit of a bubble that occurred on that one that he saw it in his right away. He was like, oh, you got a little bit of a thing. So here we see that dice pull out that difference. And that's why these are all red, is because of that bubble. So this was an outlier for Murata, not systematic because we didn't see it with the left. Anyway, neat results. Where do we see the green? We see the green, and when we're looking at AI versus consensus and consensus versus physicians, to a certain extent here, physicians versus AI. Same with the, look down at the max differences. Again, Murata, they're all high because of that little bubble that was added. So pretty interesting results for the submandibular glands. We will now jump into the parotid. We'll go in the same order, left and right. Really nice green picture here. However, it's more green. Again, it's greener over here than it is over here. What does that mean? It means when you compare any single individual versus another, these were the panelists. Here we get pretty consistent results across the row, but they are lower than if you say that same physician compared to the 3 AI engines. So this particular case, you could say the 3 AI engines all had a higher dice coefficient than any of the highest matches with an individual colleague. And the highest of all was a match with the population. Let's do the same for each physician. Look at those 3 numbers. Consensus was the highest of all. And these numbers versus AI, again, all of these are higher than the highest. Now, the differences aren't that huge. So statistical significance here is hard because we're only looking at one data set. But it's an interesting result, all right? It's an interesting clue. And we see the same result here. Here we see one of the AI vendors just a hair lower than the highest, but again, the highest number is versus consensus. And then we see the same trend as well. So Dr. Fuller, for example, while it looks like he didn't have the best agreement with his colleagues, he had very high agreement with all 3 AI engines and a very healthy agreement with the consensus. Now look at AI versus consensus. All of those are high dice numbers. This is intriguing. This again kind of points to a robust usage of a consensus as a very useful construct. If we get enough physicians to contour, then the ISO agreement, and this is, I shouldn't skip over this. Look at that. Not only did each AI vendor match a consensus line well, it matched the same consensus line, 41%. What are the odds? What are the odds? That's exciting. We should all be excited. Here we see when you get to that very sensitive metric of max distance difference, max surface difference, we do see some redder numbers here. Now, if we remember from the individual interviews, some of the parotid AI, they went and they contoured up, anterior a little bit, and that was explained why. So there is a pretty healthy debate that should be had about contouring there in the superior anterior direction to discuss whether that should be done or not. Because just because this had a high, let's say, I'll pick on limbus here, just because limbus had a bigger max difference than versus Dr. Brower than any of the colleagues, doesn't necessarily mean that's not something to look at. This, if you watch the limbus interview, this was intentional. They contoured that on purpose. I believe the similar discussion was had with Murata, but in this case, the Murata versus Brower had a much smaller difference. So very, very interesting. And again, all the consensus results are visible and all the expert results are visible on Prono for anybody who participated. Log in, navigate through. Let's do the right parotid. We should kind of expect similar stuff. And okay, now, so let's just, don't let the red distract you. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's look up here again, and we see again a lot of bright green. So in this regard, we had probably the best agreement between the experts. I mean, they had differences. You can look at their contours, and they had differences, but these are pretty green all together, clustered in a, it's not above 0.9, but it's 0.85 and above. Bigger numbers when you compare versus a well-rounded consensus ISO agreement line, all kind of in this range of 33 to 43. So that consensus sweet spot seems to be honing in around 40%, where the consensus of a parotid with a lot of population of kind of generalists starts to look like a pretty robust contour, to be honest. But again, we see these physicians should be excited about how much time they may be able to start saving doing something like a parotid with, probably any of the engines here, probably other ones too that I didn't talk to. I just don't know. So this is exciting. Down here, when we look at the difference, max difference, more or less 10 millimeters or less for the experts in this square. Same for rad formation AI. Limbus and Murata, this was very interesting. This is the right parotid. That's exactly right. So that's where both of these engines, if you go over those interviews, they had the contour, they had that little wing go up. Intentional for both. So they would talk, you can, if these are your vendors, or you can just call and say, hey, why did you contour it up like that? Because they did this intentionally. So I think they would stand by these. But I also think they should talk with the experts about why the experts don't contour it. So again, red doesn't mean bad. Red means let's talk about it. All right, the next structure is, I think it's the brainstem. Yep. Brainstem should have been boring, but it actually matched less than the parotids in the submandibular glands. So you can kind of, now that you kind of know the rhythm here, here we see in general the inter-expert agreement here was a little more green on average, maybe with the exception of Limbus looks greener. But rad formation and Murata has slightly different opinion. Still high dice numbers, you know. Don't let the color coding fool you too much. You can look at the numbers. But it's a little less green than the interphysician. Those two are. However, again, looking at the physicians with the consensus, the highest number of this entire row is physician versus consensus. The highest number of this row is actually physician versus Limbus. The highest number of this row is Caudel versus Limbus with a very close consensus. Higher number. So you can kind of play these games and take screen captures and be your own detective. Here the highest was Dr. Fuller versus consensus. So if you're not a fan of what we can learn from the wisdom of the crowd, you should be becoming a fan. Consensus versus AI, all really high numbers, which speaks well, I think, to how these deep learning engines are taught, which is with a lot of different inputs. So I think some of the phenomena that happens in the consensus averaging to a certain degree might be happening in deep learning. I'm not sure, because they have well-curated data sets, but there's still a bunch of different image sets and contours. So you're going to get some averaging effect. Here, this was an interesting thing, I thought. For the brainstem, all of the max difference here, all things considered, was quite small. 7.12 millimeters was the highest difference. We did see a bigger difference over here with the AI on average by, a few millimeters. So where there are differences, we can explore, because we can tighten these up and discuss, who really is right. But I think starting with this population consensus and then figuring out how to maybe edit that to be perfect, and then we got ourselves a heck of a standard. Let's look at the larynx. So now we've got the two structures that had really high variation. The larynx, so don't be shocked by the colors. Boom, larynx, okay. You're shocked by the colors. What we can say here, actually, let's just concentrate on the dice coefficient for the physician block. Here we can say there wasn't a lot of agreement at all, except you can say Dr. Brower and Dr. Caudel had kind of an outlier of agreement versus others. So was their training similar? They have the same opinions. It's pretty interesting. We also see some bright things here where the consensus, really high consensus with Dr. Fuller and Dr. Caudel, again, relative. So those two are definitely brighter. So that's interesting. That might lead you to believe that the population in general is doing it a little bit more like Jimmy and Dave were. I don't know. But again, these agreements were at totally different percentages. So forget what I just said. So a higher number ISO agreement means it's generally small. Not generally, it's smaller. It's where 57% or more of the population thought there was brainstem there. 34% would mean we're 34%. So by definition, 34% is bigger and fully contains 57%. So it's really just interesting stuff to talk about here. And where it's really lights up, though, is when you do population versus AI, these three squares or these three rectangles. Again, though, at different levels. So these three AIs do not agree with each other, but they do agree with certain parts, certain portions of the population. I don't know if portions is the right word, but certain ISO agreement levels. And really, there couldn't be more different. Here, Murata had an extremely high agreement with a 18% or more ISO agreement. So kind of a more liberal definition of the larynx. Larynx was a little bit different because it was most of it was in the where did you stop contouring, superior and inferiorly. So we shouldn't spend too much time on it, other than we should really define these terms a little better and these specifics about what should be contoured, because I think a lot of this variation was in instruction, not poor instructions, but just somehow we're not being specific enough. Does it include the supraglottic, etc. So let's jump into pharyngeal constrictors. This was everyone was kind of in the same area, but again, where people started and ended was very different. And then also on any given slice, they weren't, to what degree it was contoured. So a lot of red. This means a lot of variation. Again, we can kind of look and see where was there significant agreement with the physicians. A lot of disagreement with the physicians is pretty much what we can, that's both in the, both metrics show that. It gets better when you compare versus the consensus. So consider the highest 0.4, 0.4, 0.3, and then almost a 0.6. We do start to see that trend is pretty dependable. If we look at the population consensus versus AI, we see our highest overlap regions. So that is also a trend that's noteworthy. And to me, comforting about AI, it means AI is really kind of representing a non-extreme average of the wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, which is a good thing in general. Here, first of all, one thing we should commend, all AI engines, all these three AI engines, they all produced the constrictor muscles. So for AI to do that, that's pretty neat. I don't remember a couple of years ago seeing any AI engines producing these kinds of structures, and now 3 for 3 they all did. So that's good. We do see some high agreement. So if we want to we can look and say, like there's a really high one. So Dr. Jimmy Caudell and Rad Formation had a really nice agreement, really close to limits as well, relatively speaking. I mean, they're not as high as the dice as we've seen. So you can kind of look and kind of make your own conclusions there. And then for max differences here, there were a couple, it's a lot of red. One thing that lit up was, again, we saw pretty good agreement in this rectangle, and we see a very low disagreement, a relatively small max disagreement between this AI and this physician, and kind of the same thing here. So I hope these tables were useful. One thing that's important is we can't really draw any conclusions from these tables. You certainly can't determine who's right and who's wrong in terms of the physicians. You cannot determine which AI engine is their superiority of one versus another. Those are not the conclusions we can make at all from these tables. But what we can conclude, I believe, is that we should be very interested in studying the consensus with the potential to build standards that people can use for training, for AI validation, for figuring out where we agree and disagree so we can enhance our training to drive out variation. And that's easily one thing that's showing promise. We have to do more studies, of course. And then I think what I really see, and this is just my opinion, but I think most people would agree, there's a lot of value in as you're commissioning or as you're evaluating AI and maybe commissioning it after you purchase it, don't just compare to your individual physicians. Of course, you want to do that. It's also useful to compare it with a consensus, because that may tell you, oh, it doesn't necessarily agree with one of our physicians, but it does agree with a bigger population of physicians. And then you can try to figure out maybe why that physician is a particular outlier. So I told you it was a mystery. I told you you would be a detective, and we are just really starting to write this book together on consensus contouring and the things we can learn from it. So thank you for your attention, and have a great day.